Good evening. It's a pleasure to be here. The last time I was here, I introduced someone else, and I think it's a little bit more fun to talk myself. And I have a great topic to talk about today. As you know, it's this pyramid and the Sphinx of Egypt, the most durable of the seven wonders of the ancient world. Now, I say ancient world because I'm working from a different list. As we go on tonight, you'll understand a little bit more about it and why I've said that. The compilation of the seven wonders of the ancient world is not a modern invention, however. I didn't come up with it. It's not like David Letterman's 10 best list on The Late Show either. The idea derives from groupings that were assembled much earlier in history. And here are what are usually referred to as the seven wonders of the ancient world. Now, the first wonders list is usually attributed to Antipater of Sidon in the first half of the 2nd century. And then even earlier, in the 5th century, the famous Herodotus, who wrote a lot about Egypt, composed one. Callimachus also, and he was the chief librarian of Alexandria, in the 3rd century, also composed one. And then Philo of Byzantium is another person who also composed a list. And this is pretty much what you have. So, the first on the list is the Great Pyramid of Giza. Next, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus, the Lighthouse of Alexandria. One of our lectures in this series will be on that too. The Mausoleum of Halicarnassus, the statue of Zeus at Olympia, the Colossus of Rhodes. Note that Egypt had 2 entries, both on the architecture list. There are usually 5 on the architecture list and 2 on statuary. Now, although changes occurred over the years, some variation of the phrase Egyptian pyramid remained one of the few permanent fixtures throughout all of the ages. The Great Pyramid is the phrase that appears most frequently without the name of its pharaoh or its builder, and in Egyptian that's Khufu, in Greek it's Cheops. There we go. The other term that's used is the pyramid at Giza, the Great Pyramid at Giza. And I think that may have been to deal with the specificity of the site that they were talking about, and very likely. Then the third term was the pyramids of Egypt. And this may have also been to try to clarify the situation, because in fact Egypt had over 140 pyramids. Now, in none of these lists, however, do they have the Sphinx. And I think the Sphinx is a very important addition because it is a very important part of the complex at Giza, and I think that it should be added. And you can see from these examples that I've just shown you how important a part of the complex it really is. I also put it on my lecture title because we have a great Sphinx, and I'm sure you all, most of you, if not all of you, have seen it in Lower Egyptian Gallery, and it has just celebrated its 100th year here in Philadelphia. And we can proudly say that it is the largest Sphinx in the Western Hemisphere, or at least that's what we were saying this whole year, until I realized I now have to qualify it and call it the largest real Sphinx in the Western Hemisphere, because this is even larger. So, one of the things that I wanted to talk about was answering some of the questions as to why the Giza pyramids maintained the top position on the list of great wonders all these years. Well, one of the things is that it is the oldest of them. It's also the only one that has survived all these years. And it is in a marvelous state of preservation. The other thing is that it has had continuous use of the site for thousands of years. Priests and religious functions still function there almost 2,000 years later or after it was built. It was a very popular tourist site, certainly during the Greek period and even earlier. And as you can see from here, these are Greek graffiti at the southern temple of Ramses II at Abu Simbel. Now, I also put together a whole bunch of facts, because if I don't do that now, I'm sure that I'm going to be asked afterwards, and then I always forget these numbers, so I figured I would get them all together, and then we can go over them if you want later. The word pyramid may not actually be an ancient Egyptian word. Most dictionaries tell you that it's derived from the Greek word pyramis, a type of wheat cake. I'm not sure how this actually goes into pyramid, but one of the articles I read said that some of these Greek cakes took a triangular shape, so maybe the Greeks were using this satirically. Don't know for sure. The only Egyptian possibility is an uncommon phrase pronounced piri-em-us, and it means the height of a pyramid over 2,000 years after the pyramids were built. So I'm not sure that that's of any help. One of the suggestions as to why its shape came into being is that it may symbolize the rays of the sun by which Pharaoh ascends to the sky. Now, the largest of the pyramids is that of Khufu, who was the second pharaoh of the 4th dynasty. And he ruled about 25 years, somewhere in that time period, possibly as much as 30. There's a hair trigger on this pointer. All right, so you have Khufu on the left and his pyramid on the right. This is the only known three-dimensional figure of the great King Khufu. What's interesting is it's about this big, and his pyramid is almost 500 feet high. So it's sort of ironic that the creator of the world's greatest pyramid has one of the smallest statues that we know about. Now, as I said, almost 500. Technically today, it's 481 feet high. But Herodotus, the 5th century Greek historian, when he described it, he said that it, or at least he claimed that it had actually reached 800 feet high. This is an extreme exaggeration, and it's one of the indications that it's likely that Herodotus, number one, was not actually saying these things on his own. He was taking second, third, fourth, or even fifth-hand information, and very possibly never even went to Egypt at all. How about the amount of blocks? There are plus or minus 2.3 million local stone blocks, most of which were limestone for the core, and they range in weight, but with an average weight of about 2.5 tons. A final layer consisting of smooth, very fine limestone, called Tura limestone from further away, has not survived. Nor have several lower courses of granite, which also came from several hundred miles south, and also the capstone. but recent restorers have come to suggest that this is probably what it must have looked like. It's pretty incredible. Now, here's another fact. All of this was probably built, I know this is not a great slide, but there are so many different possibilities. But Mark Lehner, who is the real expert in this and even has a NOVA show on it, has come up with all these designs for all the different possible ramps that were constructed. And he feels that it was basically an exterior ramp system. But just as I was putting the finishing touches on this, I read that somebody else has now suggested that there were interior ramps. And I haven't figured out how that could possibly happen. Well, maybe this is the way it happened. You can see one of the things that we Egyptologists have to deal with all the time is, well, how did they build the pyramids? And of course, the obvious answer is by aliens. And one of the things that I am shown often is this obvious hieroglyph of some kind of alien starship. Now, it isn't actually, I don't want to make too much fun of this, but what the reality is, and we actually have it in our own collection too, is that the Egyptians very often recarved inscriptions, and that's what happened here. And just as in the case with our Ramesside statue upstairs, where there was a correction in it that was made, and then the offending parts were just simply plastered over, and in time the plaster has fallen out. And that's exactly what you see here. Now, a couple of other facts. The estimated size of the workforce on the project and the amount of time to completion. Now, this has varied among different authors and also over time. The one thing is that the amount of time it took ranges for between 20 and 30 years, and that actually has to be correct because we know that Khufu reigned about 25 years. So that's not a mistake. Herodotus and Diodorus decided that there were 3 monthly shifts with 100,000 slaves in each one, and it took 10 years to build the track to get the stones there, which was then used for the causeway, and then 20 years to build the pyramid itself, which is a total of 30 years. So that's in the 5th century BC. Emery and Petrie in the late 19th, early 20th century decided that there were also 4,000 skilled permanent workers plus 100,000 seasonal workers, and they were set up in gangs, and that it took at least 20 years. Now, Mark Lehner, whom I mentioned before, said that it took about 4,000 to 5,000 permanent staff members, and then 25,000 to 30,000 in shifts to build the pyramid. And over the years, that would be over 100,000 men, which is about the smallest amount that any have suggested. And his idea was that it was a 20-year period. Permanent crews, gangs, and files, what we call them, these are divisions with probably about 10 men in each. And all of these suggestions, as I said, fit into the time that's been allotted to the king's reign through our king lists. Now, fact number 6, I've actually been numbering these, is that none of these pyramids that you're going to see were ever built by slaves. Zahi Hawass, whom you heard speak here in April, showed you some of the examples from this slide. These are the tombs of the pyramid builders. So these are the ancient Egyptians who actually built the pyramids. I'll show you some more evidence of it. Now, one of the things you might be thinking of, and certainly a lot of people did, is this is a real vanity project, and it must have cost a good amount in order to construct it, such a funerary monument. And it not only interests modern people, it also interested the ancients. Now, the not too reliable Herodotus, again, repeated the otherwise unattested allegation that Khufu in order to help pay for everything, forced his daughter into prostitution. This was in order to raise funds for his construction project. And then later, in Herodotus's report, he suggested that in the course of her strenuous task, this enterprising young lady demanded an extra block from each of her clients. And this was a way that she could build her own pyramid. Now, yes, it's written in history, but no, there is no evidence of any of the daughters of Khufu to have had pyramids. What we do have is one of his granddaughter's tombs, and this is just like the nobility what they would have had. And so here is the granddaughter of Khufu, and here are statues of her. So no pyramid, so much for this conclusion that Herodotus had. Now, one thing that in the pyramid complex that we do know is that there were other pyramids. And as you can see here, both in the lower slide and in the upper plans, that there were these subsidiary pyramids. A few of them belonged to some of the queens, and then one of them belonged to Khufu himself, and that was for his ka, or a spiritual element of him. Now, the pyramids, the Great Pyramid and the ones that immediately followed it, had an upper temple, which was attached to the pyramid, and then a causeway that goes down to the valley, and there's a valley temple at the very end of it. And you can see this just being shown in the plan above. You can see right over here, moving down, this is where we're talking about. And here is this is the upper temple, and you can make out some of the floor pavement there. And this is a basalt, so this was incredibly beautiful when it was original. Now, the interior is no less a wonder than the exterior. Here are some of the chambers, which I should have told you about. There are 3 of them, and you can see some of them right here. We're going to talk in about a minute or so about this. But you can see that what I just mentioned to you, this is the Valley Temple. Here is the causeway down to this is the upper temple. The causeway is down here. And this is the upper chamber. This is the so-called Queen's Chamber. And then you have a lower chamber. So there are 3. Now, this is the upper chamber, and this is where the king was buried. That is his sarcophagus. Now, there was nothing left when this was discovered, so this is what we assume to have been where he was buried. There are also these shafts that go up into the walls of the burial chamber, both the upper and the lower one. And 2 of them actually go straight out through the pyramid and then open up. 2 others don't. And the ones that open up seem to go out to the polar stars. And that is something that I'll get onto in just a few minutes. Now, over here, this is the Grand Gallery, which we're going to see in just a minute. And then there are these little blocks that are over here that slid down to prevent any entrance once the pyramid was completed. But of course, as you know, that really didn't do very much. This is a real feat of engineering here. This is the burial chamber, and above it, you have these stress relievers, and these are to prevent any of the pressure coming down from the top so that this will prevent the pyramid from collapsing. What's very interesting that up here on the blocks are hieroglyphs, and in the oval area, that's the name of the king, and this gives one of the gangs of workers who were in there, and this is one of our early Egyptian graffiti. And it's showing you that it wasn't ancient aliens at all, it was the ancient Egyptians. The Grand Gallery, for me, is an absolutely breathtaking place. And this is the center of the pyramid, and as you walk up here, you look up at the ceiling, and you see that the walls come out and are sort of like the reverse of cantilevering. It's called corbelling, and it manages to keep everything intact, or at least up to this point. That that I just showed you, the Grand Gallery, is 86 feet high, and going back to the sarcophagus of the king and the burial chamber, and this is one of those shafts that goes up, and this is the other of the shafts. And when you read some people's reports on the pyramids, they tell you that's for air for the workers, and that's now been disputed. The ones that you see here in the king's chamber penetrated to the outside, and this has been thought also to be where the space would be for the spiritualized essence of the king to be able to go up into the heavens to join the gods and be in his afterlife. And again, they're oriented toward the northern polar stars. Now, there are a few scholars who tell you that the Sphinx actually doesn't belong to Khufu's son, Khephren, or Khafre, but actually to him, Khufu. So I've put the Sphinx's face here, and then the other two on the other side, and I'll leave it to you to make a decision as to who the Sphinx belongs to. Now, one of the other wonders of this site, because there are many, are the boats. And over here you can see these boat pits, and then over here are two more. And this is when they opened them up. You can see one of them still is intact, and the other one they took out, and they put this together. And it is absolutely incredible. It took almost 60 years to reassemble it, and one man discovered it, and in one of my early trips to Egypt, I got a chance to meet him, and he was the most unassuming individual you've ever met. What's amazing about this is that it's 150 feet long, and that almost everything that you see, except for one of those oars, is original. Even the rope that lashed the wood together is original. It's absolutely incredible. Now, was he the first one to have such a vehicle? No. Actually, there are forerunners, like for almost everything else in this complex, and I'm only going to talk about two of them. And the first one is the boats. Now, what you're looking at are a few of the boat graves. There are actually 14 of them at the site of Abydos. And another Penn colleague, David O'Connor, who's now at the Institute of Fine Arts, his team discovered these at Abydos several years ago. And it's between a tomb that likely dates to the First Dynasty and a slightly later ritual enclosure, so it's about 3000 BCE. So we're talking easily about 600 years earlier. That's where this came from, and there were even earlier boats. Now, Khufu's pyramid itself derives from an earlier pyramid. And the one I'm going to show you is that of King Djoser. And you see his figure on the left, and you can see that's a seated statue of him, one of the earliest Egyptians to be shown with a mustache, by the way. And then you see him running the Jubilee below in his pyramid. And he built his pyramid structure at Saqqara. And it went through several stages. The last of it started out as a flat one, and then there were some stages, steps put into it, and it winds up with 6 steps that you see here. Now, what is that supposed to mean? So I'm showing you 2 hieroglyphs that can mean rise, cause to arise, or even arise. And they may actually give us some clue as to what this step pyramid was supposed to be. And at the end of the hieroglyphic word, you can see that there is a sign that looks like that step pyramid. And actually, in some of the original ones, this is just a copy, it also has 6 steps. And it seems to be a monumental staircase for the king's heavenly ascent to join the gods. Now, on a close-up, I want you to take a look at the stones, because we just saw that with Khufu. Djoser's stones were tiny in comparison, and the reason was the architect was great. His name was Imhotep. He really was he was a brilliant man, but he didn't trust that this would be enough to support all of the weight. So earlier monuments were built of mud brick, so he built this monument out of stones that were the size of mud brick. Now, confidence in the construction method, however, in just a few generations, led the next dynasty, the 4th dynasty builders, to enlarge the blocks under Khafre, Khephren, Menkaure. And you see the incredible size of the complexes that they were building, and then these stones are absolutely huge. And if you climb up these, which they don't let you do, but I did when I was a lot younger, I wouldn't do it today, they come up to about mid-chest on me, so they're much larger than the size of bricks. Now, here is a Sphinx, and here is Khufu's son's pyramid, and here's Khufu's pyramid. This is the boat museum and I just showed you the boat just a minute ago. Now, one of the things that I don't know if you can see it from here, but Khufu's is in the foreground and Khafre's is in the background. Now, Khafre's is actually 470 feet high, and so it's 10 feet lower. Its position, however, is on a higher part of the plateau, so it makes it appear as if it is actually higher. Now, I don't know, it's not going to be visible in that one. No, I'm sorry. Trust me, in all of the others, it does look there. Which one looks the biggest? On the bottom one, it's the one in the middle, and that is Khafre. So it's probably on purpose that he did this. And it made a win-win situation. It may have been actually shorter for decorum, but then visibly taller for Khafre, the son's image. It would be ironic, however, if the term Great Pyramid, used in the original text in the 5th century BCE, referred to Khafre and not Khufu, and Khufu's was actually the taller of the two. Now, the Sphinx itself dominates the eastern part of the complex. And you can see here, you get the feeling of how huge it is. And any of you who've been there knows that if you stood, you'd be about this high. So how big is it? And I love getting these kinds of statistics. It's 240 feet long, just shy of the length of a football field. And it's almost 70 feet high, which is about the height of the White House. I'm sure these analogies are very helpful for you. But it is Egypt's largest statue, and it's still worthy of respect 1,000 years after its production, and then even more into today. Now I show you these two images. On the left, I'll talk about this in just a minute. This is obviously the Sphinx in Egypt. On the right, it's also an image of the Sphinx. On the left, it dates to about 1400, so it's about 1,000 years after. And then on the right, this is a 19th century painting now in the Museum of Fine Arts. And you can see that the Holy Family was resting between the paws of the Sphinx. So obviously, this was an important message to get across. And then on the left, what I'm going to concentrate on is what's between the Sphinx, the paws of the actual Sphinx here. And this is a stele of a man who later became king. His name is Thutmose IV, and he is of the family that eventually produced King Tut. And that's him there. His name is Thutmose IV. But when he was still a prince, his name was Menkhepurura. And he was very athletic, and he loved to go out hunting. And one day, he was hunting in the deserts of Egypt, and it's very hot there. So around midday, he got tired, and he decided to rest in the paws of the Sphinx. Let me go back. And he fell asleep. He had a dream, and this is called the dream stele. And after this, after he had the dream, eventually he became king, and he decided to put this stele up to explain this miracle that happened to him. So he recorded what had actually occurred, and I'll quote to you what he actually wrote. One of these days it happened that he rested in the shade of the Sphinx at the time of midday in the shadow of the great god that is the Sphinx. And he found the majesty of this noble god speaking with his own mouth. And he said, "Look at me, see me, my son. Here is what I will do for you. I shall give you the kingship on earth in front of all living ones." Now, of course, you don't get anything for nothing. So he goes on, and he says, "Here is what I need you to do for me. My present condition is like one that is in need. All my limbs are dismembered as the sands of the desert upon which I lie have reached me. So run to me, to have done that which I desire." Now, as with all predictions that occur after the fact, that's what happened. So he was a prince who was not in line to be the king, and he did what he was told to do, and he became king. Of course, it was bound to happen since he predicted it after it actually happened. Now, the last of the great sphinxes belongs to Khafre's son, and his name was Menkaure. So here is his pyramid. I showed you a picture of him a little bit earlier, the smallest of the pyramids in the background. Now, taken together, we can perceive there were interrelationships between or among these three pyramids. And this is very important because it's not just the Great Pyramid, but everything worked together with these three. And you can see from this red diagonal line that it picks up the southeast corners of each one of them, and it is absolutely perfect. I know that's usually the point at which, you know, the people who believe in the ancient astronauts say, well, how else could it have occurred if it weren't for ancient astronauts? Well, let me just say that I mentioned that there were 140 pyramids. I'm not going to show you all of them, but I thought I would show you a few of them to explain what actually happens. These were by no means the last of the pyramids, the royal pyramids of Egypt, but the grand heights, the scale, the effect, and the statement that they made really had no followers that equaled them. But let me show you just a few. Here you see Unis's pyramid of the 5th dynasty. And it's not the outside that's important on this one, but what's on the inside. The first time that we actually have pyramid texts. These are spells that the king will use to get into the afterlife, or at least to ensure his getting into the afterlife. One of his followers in the 6th dynasty, Teti. And you'll notice in this particular image, you can see the step pyramid over in the background, and this just looks like a pile of sand. I have to tell you it isn't. And here are the tombs that we actually work in right in this area, so our expedition to Saqqara. Now, if we move into the Middle Kingdom, as I said, I'm just going to show you a few. You can see that the core of the pyramids is no longer made up of these huge blocks, these millions of blocks. They're using outcrops of stone and then rubble as filler. And here, this is Amenemhat I, the first ruler of the 12th dynasty. And this is at Lisht. And here you see Senwosret II, his pyramid at Lahun. And you can clearly see the base, the core of this pyramid is not blocks. Now, in the second intermediate period, there's virtually nothing left, and this is the last major pyramid that was built in Egypt for royal burial. And the man's name is Kenjer, and this is again at Saqqara, like Unis and Teti. When we go into the New Kingdom, there are virtually no royal pyramids. This is one of the few. And there's this one is at Abydos, and also done by a Penn archaeologist, a former student, whose name is Stephen Harvey. And he's now proved that the kind of construction that you see here was built. And he's still actually now not even sure that it was a ritual one or not. But I don't have the last word about that. Now, one of the things I also wanted to say to you is that I wanted to ask a question that you might have is, why did they continue to build these things when they all were robbed? Because, in fact, all of the pyramids were robbed. And when you think about it, these monuments had, in essence, were basically a great big sign, maybe even neon, that said, "This way to the gold." And all of these pyramids were robbed. To foil the plunderers, they developed different protection systems. In the Great Pyramid, they had portcullis stones that just slid into place. And if you want to know how that actually worked, then there is a movie called Land of the Pharaohs, and they actually show you in that movie how it works, and it's the only thing in the entire movie that I think is accurate. So what were the other ways? Well, the one that I'm going to show you now, and just for a few minutes, is they went into the concept of symbolic pyramids. And they constructed burials within high hills, raised cliffs, and in mountains. And all of these were in the south, which is where all of these kinds of, this kind of terrain would actually occur. So, in chronological order, I show you from the first intermediate period. Here is Antifi's monument, and this is, along with several others, other people from this time period. He wasn't quite a royal, and if he is in the afterlife, he's probably very happy that I put him in this list with other royal figures. In the 11th dynasty, and this is probably one of the major shifts, this concept really takes hold. And you can see over here, this is in Thebes, on the other side of the Valley of the Kings, which has not yet been established. In the 11th dynasty, Mentuhotep the second builds his temple and tomb right into these cliffs, and at the very top of which is a natural pyramid. I don't think it's an error. I'm not so sure about Ankhtifi at Moala, the last one, but in this one, I don't think so. And when you take a look here, you can see, looking down at it, and over here, actually not in view, would be the top of the cliff. Here is another example of it. Now, this is the old one here in the old books, but Dieter Arnold, who is at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, has excavated this and decided that through great scientific thought, he's able to conclude that there was no pyramid there. And in fact, there wasn't any that was necessary. The way that he was able to conclude it is he had no blocks that were left that were slanted. So it couldn't have been a pyramid. And in fact, as I said, there wouldn't be any need for it. Now, in Abydos, our own Joe Wegner, my colleague in the department, has come up with similar conclusions. And you can see here is a natural pyramid at Abydos. And within the structure, you can see the interior structure. This is the actual tomb, not a ritual tomb, of the pharaoh Senwosret III. And here you can see that it's not a small structure. Now we're going to go back to move ahead to the 18th dynasty, and going back to the same structure that I showed you before at the Valley of the Kings. Now we're on the other side. Mentuhotep II is down on that side, and here we're entering into the Valley of the Kings, where Tutankhamun is down in this area. Standing on the top, looking down into it, these are all the tombs of the pharaohs of the 18th through the 20th dynasty. You're probably thinking, how come only kings got to have pyramids? It's a good thought, because in the beginning, when you have pyramid texts, you get to think, well, why didn't private people take them over? In fact, they actually did. We call them coffin texts. And then people begin to think about, why do just the nobility have them? Well, nobility had them because they could afford them, but then eventually they watered down to private people. We have books of the dead and then amulets. And so these things eventually get down to some of the private people. And what you're looking at is a site called Deir el-Medina. It's at Thebes, and it's not too far from the Valley of the Kings. And the reason it's not too far is this is where the artisans lived who actually decorated the tombs. And these guys had their cemeteries. Actually, it's right up in this area over here. But here's the city itself, and this is the cemetery area here. They even had their own temple. And if you go across here, this is where you get to the area close to the Valley of the Kings. So what did their tombs look like? If you go upstairs into our mummy room, you can see one of them. It's called Senedjem. But what I wanted to show you is what was on top of their tombs. So they had little pyramids. And this is, they are certainly by no means the only ones who had these. I think they're pretty incredible. And up here, there would be a statue of the individual with his hands up in prayer, worshiping to the rising and setting sun. And there were literally 60 or 70 of these, and there's an indication there may have been several hundred. Now, pyramids in Egypt continue. Remember, I said 140, but not necessarily. There are 140, but they not only continued in Egypt, they also took root in Nubia. And there are a couple of sites I'm going to show you fairly quickly. One of them is Nuri that you see here, and we have the map that shows you where they are. These are small. They're not very large, but if we continue on, more Nubian pyramids here at Meroe, and you can see how far south that actually is. Now, Closer to our own times, we find pyramid motifs in various parts of the world, and some of them are actually quite close. So here we see in 2 cemeteries pyramids that are doing exactly what they were doing thousands of years earlier. One in Brooklyn and one in Nashville. They're not limited to funerary uses today, however. And here you see some more recent pyramids that have been built. We see our own Philadelphia Pyramid Club down here. The Memphis Sports Arena and the Grand Rapids Corporate Center. And this is a pyramid structure that houses the rainforest in Galveston, Texas. And perhaps one of the most famous of the pyramids these days is the glass pyramid in the courtyard of the Louvre. So I have to ask you now, did any of the other great wonders have such a following? Are there hanging of gardens Babylon sports centers? Do we have the mausoleum of Halicarnassus corporate center? No. So I would say for concept, construction, splendor, longevity, interest, symbolism, message, image, inspiration, and long-term effect, the Great Pyramids rightly deserve their place on the list of great wonders. Now, while it's even, I wouldn't say the best of the examples, it certainly is a high point for the pyramids being one of the great wonders of the ancient world when it was included in Neiman Marcus's Christmas ornaments of 10 years ago. So you can see that the Great Pyramids have certainly gone a long way in several thousand years. And I leave you with that, and if we can have the lights on, I'll be happy to take any questions. Thank you.